Okay, so hi everybody. Welcome back again to this session. As you saw in the chat, Kevin left this link to a YouTube video of the facility in Cape Town. You're welcome to look at that at your free time. But now we're going to change gears a little bit. And Richard from the UK, and you've heard a little bit about the UK ULL, is going to tell us about the application of the water, energy, food nexus, a different part of the world, and kind of give some presentations and of case studies. And with that, I will let Richard take over. He will also introduce himself and his background.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Adina. Hi, everyone. My name is Richard Nunes. I've been living in the UK for a number of years now. As a lecturer at the University of Reading, but also at other universities, including UCL, and too many to list. But I come from a background in architecture and design, and at the moment, and also urban planning. And what I do at the moment is I lecture on urban design and sustainability. So what I like to bring to you today is a bit of a reflection on water, energy and food nexus, which is a topic that I'm interested in. I was involved in the project with Esther, and having done some work in Brazil, not necessarily in the nexus topic, but thinking about food at the city regional level. Obviously, as a planner, I have a lot of interest in thinking about the role of cities in these sorts of topics. So I think my approach today is going to try and bring to you a reflection on the nexus of water, energy, and food, but also that nexus and its nexus with the city, right? And the city is about people, it's about places, it's about how we interact with these places. And from my architecture background, it's a lot about how we interact with buildings. So when I lecture to my students are studying real estate, and they're also studying planning. They're not studying to become architects. They're not studying to become urban designers, but they're going to be future developers, builders, planners of that sort. And when I lecture on this topic, I want them to begin to think about not just the nexus as a topic. I want them to begin to think about the role that the city plays in delivering the nexus to an extent, and how we might rethink the city, or how we might rethink the building. Now, we can think about the city as made up of lots of buildings and roads and so on. But when I talk, especially to the real estate students about the building, I like to think of the building as drawing together a lot of different systems, urban systems together. And the nexus is an excellent concept for that, because it brings water systems and it brings energy systems and food systems together. And when you bring that and cross it with the building, you begin to think, gosh, well, the building is not just housing people or uses. It's actually doing something more. It's putting back into the environment. It's not just taking in terms of a negative impact, but it can potentially contribute to the environment in terms of it can produce energy, it can filter water and reuse it, repurpose it. It can help to produce food. So you can do a lot in one building. And there are some excellent examples around the world that are beginning to emerge around this idea of a building, one unit, sort of housing all of these systems compressed into one place. And in that sense, you get this building, which is almost a conglomeration of a city or a place, right? Where we can inhabit a building and a place at the same time and experience all of these systems. Now, there's some general concepts around this, which are concepts like the biophilic city, designing with nature, or you oftentimes also will hear about buildings as ecosystems, or urban ecology. So all of these ideas are really trying to draw on systems as we think about them in the natural and how they come together. But in this topic, in this short presentation to you all today, I also want to bring this other dimension to this concept and this idea of thinking about the nexus as it crosses with cities and buildings and so on, is this notion of transition, right? So we're not in the place of in all buildings, in all cities, experiencing the nexus. And the nexus is a topic that's quite abstract. So we don't look out our windows and see the nexus as such, right? So the nexus is something that we aspire to. It's a goal, if you will. It forces us to think differently. It's at the level of a paradigm, right? To an extent. It's a way of thinking, a way of potentially doing things. And how we might do that in different countries will be very different depending on the political context, economic resources, a whole range of different things. And I want you to also think about that too. So we're going to reflect a bit on that toward the end. And I'll do that purposely by engaging this idea of justice, right? Okay, it's a very broad term, but this notion of getting to where we might want to be in the future, a transition, sort of move from where we are currently, how we do and know things, to a different way of doing and knowing, would be a transition. Now, there are some Egyptian scholars that are already talking about these transitions, socio and technical transitions, but with some emphasis on justice, right? So as we transition toward some better future, greener future, or toward a nexus or some idea or of a nexus, how do we take into consideration the impact that it can potentially have on poorer communities, for instance? So as we take on different technologies, what's the impact that it might have on existing jobs, for instance, right? Who's helping us deliver the nexus, right? Or these nexus ideas? So there's a lot to think about. And what I'd like to do is just give you some, in a sense, footnotes or bookmarks for some of these considerations as we go throughout. Okay. Sorry, Dina, just very briefly, I have this. Oh, there we go. I can move that over to the slide.
Yeah, we see your lecture, your PowerPoint. If you
can see it, it's all clear, right? Because I've got this display here in the front, but I need to just move it. Okay, over to the side. So what I'd like to start with is, as I was preparing the slides this week, I thought, gosh, what's the situation in Egypt? So I found this very interesting water, food, energy nexus index, which indexes a whole range of different cities throughout. And Egypt sits in a comfortable, relatively comfortable space. It's not among the worst or the best in terms of this index. You can follow the link below at the bottom of the slide to learn a bit more about other cities and how Egypt sits relative to other countries. Now, what I just wanted to draw your attention to is the diagram on the upper sort of right-hand side, where you see that access to energy and availability and food access and availability is all reasonably okay. And water access is also quite good. It's water availability. That's the real problem. And it's very, very much marked. And I'm sure that this school has picked up on that, the scarcity of water. But the current access to water is quite good, in terms of getting to it. So there are some obvious questions about the water that we can access, what we do with it, and once we use it, what happens to it, right? And so this is kind of where you get this whole question about wastewater and what we can do with wastewater. Can we still repurpose wasted water, and how can we do that? And so this idea of the nexus helps us to begin to think about that, provided we bring another concept to the mix, which is this idea of a circular economy. So I'm going to touch on that in the presentation today as well. But let's just keep moving for a bit of context. This idea of circular economies, again, is an interesting notion. I'm not sure to what extent you've discussed this already in the school, but this is a topic that came up quite a bit in our discussions on, in the project that we just finished. But the circular economies, I was thinking, to what extent is it picked up or framed within existing policy? And so I did put together a presentation last month trying to identify to what extent circular economies was picked up in South Africa, Netherlands, the UK, all the countries that were involved in our project. I found that in Brazil, it was the one country that didn't have it properly framed. So but it is in the process of doing that through the Business Association. It's not coming straight through government. In the case of Egypt, what I found was that its first mention of framing is within the new waste law, which was published a couple of years ago, as I understand it. And the notion of the circular economy is framed in relation to the big challenge around plastics, and not so much water. Now, the circular economy can apply to a lot of different products. The principal idea there is that you're repurposing what you no longer need of another product. So if you no longer need a plastic water bottle, you can recycle it, but more than just recycling it, you can put it into use into, in terms of another product that may have a plastic component to it. So when we think about water and buildings and cities, we can apply that same principle and think about its implications. In the context of Egypt, what is interesting is that in this particular piece here, which reflects a report on the state of the circular economy and circular economy being put into practice within Egypt. There are a number of projects that have already been identified, and I've put links to those up at the top. But also that there are a number of umbrella programs and policies across Egypt that already begin to provide the sort of envelope, if you will, for talking about the circular economy. So the circular economy as a notion and an idea can be easily inserted into a lot of existing policy frameworks. So don't be afraid to kind of think about these ideas, the nexus and the circular economy within the existing frameworks that you already have. And then to extend that further into the kind of traditional ideas around sustainability. So when we look at this particular one here, the Dimensions and Pillars of Egypt's Sustainable Development Strategy 2030, we see a number of components which we would typically expect of this type of strategy. But when you bring the idea of a circular economy, or think about the nexus and think about just transition, which we were talking about earlier, that social dimension is a lot about thinking about the impacts that it can have on poor communities and so on. So it's thinking about at what cost, social, even environmental or economic, delivering something good like a circular economy or a water, energy, food nexus may imply. I often tell my students that these ideas are typically framed as good practice, right? But there can be sort of downsides to them, undesirable sides to them, which we can discuss more at the very end at questions. So I also then thought, I wonder if there's any very exciting project, in architectural terms out there in Egypt, which we could consider in this context. And I found one. I believe it was built, or I can't quite still determine. I ran a number of searches, but maybe some of you out there can tell me whether it's been completed or not. It was due to be completed this year. It's called The Gate, and it's a green technology type project. I mean, you could argue it's potentially greenwashing. It brings retail and commercial together, but also has community gardens. It has green walls. And the point being here that it has a particular technology which helps it to cool itself, so relies less on energy. It can reuse wasted energy. It can produce some of its own energy, both through wind and solar. So it's generating, and it sends out the excess energy. Other aspects in terms of water, so it uses water in a very creative way. It doesn't store water or collect the water, so rainwater, but it does help to repurpose gray water and then use it for irrigation, and also uses some of the water to help cool the vertical walls, right? So it runs water through these vertical channels and keeps it vertical so that it evaporates less. But anyway, it's trying to be as creative as it can. These architects are based in Paris. They're French designers, and they've incorporated, designed this particular building. Now, there are a number of systems here, thinking about food, thinking about energy, thinking about water, that all come together into this sort of ecosystem. And this is how the architects have sort of envisioned this whole project. And this is the point I was getting on about when we think about the nexus locked into one building, which can also be thought of and upscaled to how we might think about a city as well, right?
So Richard, just to mention, this building is in Cairo, correct?
Yes, yes. So just now to kind of recap a bit maybe on what Adina may have already said. As I understand today's session, we're aiming on thinking about how water, energy, food nexus is applied at a local scale. So I'll give you a couple of examples that I've used with my students to talk about this. A little less on the living lab. I didn't bring too much on the living lab into this discussion as such, but we can talk a bit about that at the very end. Understand why the concept needs to be further refined. Now that I think I would like to have as a discussion with you as well, but I will begin to suggest some of the limits of the concept itself. And then to gain a better understanding of the challenge implied, I think some of that challenge comes with this idea of a just transition, not just moving toward a nexus, but what does that actually mean for Egypt as opposed for the Netherlands, as opposed to the UK and so on. And then developing new insights into the acceptance and involvement of the local community. Now, that is a really interesting one, because when we think about local communities, we're thinking about a certain scale, right? And communities can associate with a certain scale of activity and practice. But once we start to imagine how what is done at a community level, and begin to project what is done at that level to other scales, we start to imagine other ways of doing what we typically might understand as something that is done quite well at a community level. So do communities relate to projects like the Gate? Would they relate to projects like a community garden at the top of a retail mall? Is it the same thing as a community garden within a city, a traditional city laid out? So what does that idea of community really mean? So there is something about the meaning and the role of community in these ideas like the nexus, like the circular economy, when we want to use community or community practices as vehicles toward achieving some of these more grander ideas, which are often put out there by through policy. So on this point about policy comes obviously this idea of the implications for urban governance, right? So when governments set out strategies like the one that has been set out for Egypt, or the waste strategy and so on, there are a number of these types of strategies. You find circular economy creeping up in lots of different strategies. It's not always a sustainable development strategy. It might be a waste one, it might be something else. For example, a lot of the work that is done in the UK around urban planning is not explicit about the circular economy, but it has some aspects of it. Other policies will be very explicit about the circular economy. So you don't find a lot of consistency from country to country in terms of where it crops up. And then what comes with it in terms of this idea of a nexus. So it's important to then appreciate that this idea of a nexus as some kind of embodiment of a circular economy, and that the nexus can bring together different sectoral practices like food and energy and water, and we can begin to think about how wasted water in a city can begin to be repurposed for irrigating agriculture within a city. Urban agriculture, for instance, would be one flow of water to food, for instance, or for instance, wasted food that can be repurposed through anaerobic digestion to produce biogas, which can then be used to heat a city and so on. So as we think about the wasted products or byproducts of energy, or water, energy, and food, and their nexus, not always in their nexus, but even if we think about them separately and how they feed into other uses and products, then that's the whole spirit of the nexus as it's tied into a circular economy. Now, this oftentimes is in the imaginary, it's in people's minds and policymakers' minds. And in order for policymakers to engage with people, with cities, is to think about communities and how communities can begin to lock into some of these ideas. And immediately what we tend to do is we want to see to what extent, well, what is happening out there? What are communities doing? How can we scale up their practices? And this is where this question, the implications for urban governance, kicks in, is how do you scale up? Should we be scaling up? Do communities want to scale up, and so on? So the nexus implies an integrative kind of imaginary, okay? That's often an integration of governance of water, energy, food, but it's not the way people oftentimes think. right? And when you think about communities and their engagement with these ideas, it's much harder to, on some levels, you can think about how we can repurpose water, collect and store water, and then reuse it. And I have a garden. I do it. I do collect rainwater. So when it rains, we have water, and then we use that water. But I'm not necessarily using the wasted water from our home. So a lot of that water goes out. But we're going to look at a project shortly that has begun to explore a concept of how to work with wastewater. But in this slide, I want to explore a number of different definitions or ideas around this notion of the nexus. The other one is operationalization of the nexus seeks to integrate across systems through technological and institutional change. It's one. So it's through institutional change and technological change. In some ways, you might think the gate does that to an extent. It's very much a technological innovation, right? That's bringing these systems together, not necessarily communities or how we scale up or understand communities as such. It's very much about the technologies. Let's see. The other one is implementing this approach reveals that it's not only value neutral, which is very interesting. When we think about the association of the nexus to say mitigating climate change, right? And we look at these projects like the Gate, we can immediately begin to wonder to what extent these projects are really genuinely addressing climate change, right? By just simply looking at where these projects are situated, who's going to make most use of it, who is benefiting from these projects, and so on. And then the other one, oh, sorry, my screen's probably too small for these slides. There we go. Politicize the nexus. So given the fact that it's not value neutral, we start to get some of the politicization of the nexus when we begin to think about questions such as communities or campaigners or advocacy groups that are trying to minimize the amount of waste, and perhaps they might be targeting food waste, for instance. But then on other levels across the city, you might have other groups arguing for how we can use food waste to generate renewable energy. Now, obviously, by doing that and investing in the infrastructure to do that, we lock in that food waste. And so we're more dependent on food waste to generate that renewable energy. So it can begin to generate some political tensions when some are trying to work towards zero waste and others are locking in at waste to generate other products. And when we do that, we almost begin to create certain dependencies or interdependencies between waste and what we see as a desirable output. Hopefully that's all making sense. Now, typically within these kinds of discussions, we've been, and I'm sure you've all seen this, is this idea of the waste hierarchy. But this one I like because unlike some of the typical ones, it's more granulated, it's broken down, it's waste hierarchy 2.0. And the bit where we throw away, it's completely unacceptable. So there is a value neutral treatment to thinking about waste in this case. But I like the best use being rethinking and redesigning. So there's an aspect there of really rethinking how our systems come together. And projects like the Gate don't necessarily address the question of waste, wastewater, wasted food, and so on. It is bringing these systems together, but it's not necessarily working off of waste products. So that's a distinction that I want you to begin to make, or to just register in your minds as we go into the presentation. Look at another example. So zero waste is the conservation of all sources by means of. Sorry, Dina, I need to move that. There we go. I'm going to move you guys down there at the bottom of my screen. So zero waste is the conservation of all resources by means of responsible production, consumption, reuse, recovery of products, packaging. So this pretty much comes in, embodies the essence of this waste hierarchy. But what's really important to look at or to note is the means of responsible. So what does that actually mean, responsible? And I think if we think about that for later on for our discussion, we can take that idea of the means of being responsible to projects like the gate, right? Could the gate have gone further? Could it have done more? And so on. Now, across the EU, there is a significantly growing attention to, mounting attention to the idea of a circular economy. And there's a monitoring framework to begin to think about how we can understand the circular economy relative to development goals, sustainability development goals, and so on. So there's been a lot of work on this front, trying to map across how the circular economy can be applied and put into practice relative to a number of goals. And to some extent, I think Egypt is already moving in that direction. If you follow up the link that the reference I gave you earlier. Now, I think within that sort of appreciation of the circular economy, there are a number of, like this appreciation of the nexus, there are different approaches to thinking about the circular economy. And here are some references that you can follow up. The one that I've highlighted is the one that I feel, the one I would have adopted if I were to use, and that's that the circular economy is restorative and regenerative by design, and it aims to keep products and components and materials at their highest utility and value at all times. So it's keeping those waste byproducts of materials that we use, food, energy, water, and so on, in constant circulation, right? And I think that's a real key point to make. And then it goes on, a continuous positive development cycle that preserves and enhances natural capital, optimizes resource yields, minimizes system risks by managing finite scope. So what might be missing here, when we think about the circular economy and a move toward a circular economy? I think if we think about the point earlier about just transition, perhaps we're missing that element to an extent, right? So I think we need to sort of keep that in mind. Now, there is some consideration there of all our interests. So there's a kind of a commons interest in thinking about how we manage our finite resources. So in that sense, I think there is an aspect of thinking about the just transition. But at a more granular level, when you think about taking this idea of an economic model, translated through this idea of water, energy, food nexus, and apply it or try to put it into practice in a development like the gate, or another example, which I'll show you shortly, that whole question around the just transition becomes a lot more apparent. A lot less here at this level, but I think it's important to note that it is restorative, so it can help to restore and help to regenerate places, right, in our economy in the process. Sorry, I probably should have clicked on this. This would have been a lot easier to read, but essentially what this is just a blow up of what I had highlighted there. Okay. So here's this example I've been alluding to throughout now. This is called the Hamburg water cycle. So this is a concept that's put together by the city of Hamburg for a particular neighborhood in Hamburg, which was designed and put together by Dutch landscape architects and urban designers. Okay. Now in this quarter, let's see if we can make this a little bit more apparent. Yeah, you should be able to see the bottom of that slide. I can barely see it, unfortunately, so I'm struggling here to see it. But what you see here is you have a large neighborhood. It's currently under construction. And what you're getting is a treatment of wastewater in 3 components across this whole of the development. So you have rainwater that falls, which is collected. You have gray water, which is the water from washing your dishes, taking showers, and so on. And then you have black water, which is the water that comes out of the toilets. All the homes across this whole of this development have vacuum suction sort of toilet systems, sewer systems, or yeah, toilet systems, I think. I think they're called vacuum toilets. I'm not sure of the actual technical term. But anyway, it's a more efficient way of drawing this black water into what you see down here at the bottom at the lower right-hand corner, the black water treatment unit within the development itself. And it will collect all that black water and it will pump it through a vacuum suction, a series of sort of suction tubes, pipes, and so on. I'm not an engineer, so I can't really explain it, but it will push it into an anaerobic digester and it will help that matter to break down and generate a biogas. That biogas is then pumped into a co-generator, a combined heat and power generator, and it will then produce heat and electricity for the district. So all the homes are tied to this electrical grid, which is off-grid, and heating system, which is fed through the black water from the toilets across the whole of the development. The water that comes from washing is also filtered and then put back into use in the development for irrigation, and also for I think it's mostly for irrigation, but it is treated gray water, which can then be reused. And then rainwater is also collected through process of through sustainable urban drainage systems. So these are the grounds that are landscaped that help to collect that water and then keep the water on site to help keep the area green and lush and so on. So they treat each of these aspects of water in this way. The wastewater, being the gray and the black water, are the most unique aspects. There is digestate, which is the composite matter that comes out of the black water after being processed, after it kind of heats up and breaks down. And then that's used as additional fertilizer for the area and also exported outward. Now, it's this project, to some very different to the one in the gate. This one really does bring together this idea of how we can begin to use or think about water in relation to a kind of a circular economy idea. It is also linking in and drawing in to some extent energy, right? Because it's producing a biogas and it's combining it with other energy sources so that it can top it up if it doesn't happen, it can't produce enough biogas through the plant on the site. And it also has some links to food, but it's not drawing on food waste as such, or waste product, but it is using the gray water to irrigate urban agriculture within this development. So it's quite unique in that sense. So what you can begin to appreciate is that the treatment of water, energy, and food is not treated equally, right? The emphasis here is on water, which I felt that was more relevant to you and to this program. So the emphasis is on water with some relationship to energy and some relationship to food. There's more of a relationship to energy than there is to food in this case. But you could imagine a case where, for instance, the black water treatment facility, the anaerobic digester, could take in waste food, right? So you could add waste food to the black water and generate the biogas. So there is potential for this system to be adapted to taking in food waste as well, to enhance its output of biogas, which then gets fed through the grid to the various homes. So I think this is a super exciting project, and it is like the city of the future in some ways. Yes.
Can I ask you a question, please?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Are there any way to add food waste to the black water biomass container?
That's a more technical question, and I'm not sure how it would be done. I know that one of the case studies that we had for our project at Genco in Bristol in the UK, it was mostly through food waste that was being added to the anaerobic digester. And a lot of the anaerobic digesters, even those located on farms, do use biomass.
Okay, so it's already existed to mix food waste and black water in one biomass.
Not at the Genco site, it's food waste. Other anaerobic digesters take well, I guess in some ways, if you think about a farm, yes, I mean they will use the byproducts, from cattle, yeah, and that they're raising sheep and so on, and so there will be an element of perhaps some biomass and some black. I guess if you want to think about it, fecal matter and biomass, black water, that's all mixed into a slurry, which then is pumped into the anaerobic digester. Yes, so it is possible, but I wouldn't be able to answer it on a very technical level.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, but in principle, yes, I would have thought so. In this case, it's the model and the design is around the black water that comes directly from the toilets into a sealed system that goes straight into this anaerobic digester, right? So it's sucked like on an airplane, right? You just click the button and it goes, it just goes, right? And it goes through these tubes and it goes straight into the anaerobic digester. So it's all sealed and locked in. So, you know, I wouldn't have thought that food waste would have been added to it. But possibly, you know, that's really a question for the engineers, whether that's even possible. My guess is that it's probably not if it's all suction, you know, it's all in the, yeah, I'm not even sure how quite to explain that, but the whole thing must be under a lot of pressure, right? So that it can draw negative pressure, so that it draws the black water across.
So in the US, in sinks in the kitchen, they have a food waste grinder.
Yeah.
And throw that in the sink, it grinds and then go potentially. I don't think that's what they're doing there, but there are such options.
Yeah, that's true. So I guess you could link that to this. So at the moment, as I understand it, that is linked to the gray water. So that's going out to the gray water bit. So one of the points that they make is that they don't cross the system. So they have these three that they just find it more efficient to treat it this way, because the gray water has a lot more volume in terms of the actual amount of liquid than the toilets would produce. So they section off the toilets and treat the toilets as black water, and it goes straight to the anaerobic digester. And the gray water, which is a lot more in volume, gets processed differently. And it's a much more efficient and energy efficient way to do it. And it's a different process for treating and so on. And then they use that for irrigation and so on. Right. So we have this example of this one particular neighborhood. The homes obviously are, well, obviously it wouldn't be so obvious, but the homes are designed to a passive house standard. So they're at the kind of the top of the energy efficiency. So they demand less in terms of energy. So you can see that, you know, a development which is built at that level of efficiency doesn't demand a lot of energy. So a lot of the energy that they will generate on this site will be exported out. And this was the point I was making earlier, when we can begin to think about cities and buildings as actually contributing positively to the environment by generating a lot of that resource that we need. But on the back of waste products, right? So that is the real exciting bit when we think about the role of buildings in cities, or we're thinking about parts of cities like neighborhoods in this case, taking a part, making a constructive contribution to a circular economy. Now, a point that I was making earlier about this idea of thinking about the nexus at the kind of as a sort of a paradigm, and then thinking about it as a practice, I think is a distinction that is worth making, right? One about how we imagine the circular economy in our minds and in the minds of communities and stakeholders, how policymakers imagine these ideas and how they begin to translate or advocate for them and so on through the various policy documents and so on, campaigns, you have it. So in this diagram to the left, if we work from the left to the right, you have the split between the paradigm stage and this practice stage. So we can talk about the metrics. So if you can recall that slide where the EU is trying to work up a framework for monitoring the circular economy, they're really trying to work beyond the paradigm stage into this practice stage. They're trying to work toward tools, metrics, instruments, indicators, measures for how we can begin to understand, monitor, and evaluate the effects of the circular economy. And we could do the same for thinking about the nexus within the circular economy, or how the nexus can begin to be a part of that. the complexity comes as we begin to think about, taking it from that sort of practice stage to this, level at which we all start to buy into this idea of a circular economy in the nexus and bring different cultural backgrounds, aspirations, expectations, and so on. And then this is the point about the nexus not being value neutral, right? So you start to get this mix of different values, right, and expectations. And this whole question around the transition to some idea of a nexus and how we should transition, right? Should we be locking in food waste to generate a sustainable form of energy, or should we be just working to move away entirely from food waste, and so on? So there are going to be tensions there. Hence the point about the politicization of the nexus. So the other slightly smaller diagram, the other diagram to the right is just breaking those two aspects down a bit more. So when we think about this paradigm stage, we're thinking about organizational culture, we're thinking about corporate social responsibility, how we learn from each other, inter-organizational learning, and so on. And this is where I'll make the point about the Living Lab. The work that we did in our project in terms of thinking about the living labs in Brazil and Rotterdam and Bristol and South Africa is a lot about inter-organizational learning, how we learn from each other and how we're moving forward, and that dialogue and that discussion. And the living labs are really important for working through that complexity of the diversity of values, worldviews, and so on, and trying to find pathways, if you will, transitions, right? Paths to some imaginary of the nexus, right? And that could be the gate, right? But for others, that might not be sufficient, right? And so on. So what's important to know is that the circular economy has this kind of umbrella notion around this idea of the nexus, which the nexus can be an instrument for. Carries with itself a diversity of different descriptions. So we've looked at some of that, different types of arguments, right? Arguments for how we might reuse water, and in what way, and how should it be applied? Should it be applied at the level of a major retail establishment, or should it be a small neighborhood, or could it be both, and can it be done well at both of those through both types of development? This particular work here argues is that we need to give a higher priority to its different applications, right, and begin to look at the different ways in which the idea of the nexus is underneath this kind of umbrella of the circular economy is put into practice. And the reason that a lot of academics are talking about this, and you might have come across already a couple of papers in the course of the school, is because it's still quite experimental, right? There's still a lot of work ongoing. Some of these notions are still, to many stakeholders, still quite abstract. And so this type of argument, giving weight, placing more priority on weight in terms of the different applications, is really an argument for saying, let's look at this case of the Hamburg water cycle, and let's look at this case of the gate, and let's compare them. What can we learn from them? How are they different? How are they similar? Are they both aspiring to the nexus? In what sense are they working toward a just transition? So it's these kinds of questions that we should be asking ourselves at this stage. So this brings me to my last slide. I think I need to make one other click here, which is, oh gosh, I need to sort of move some of these images. Sorry. So in this slide here, what I've brought out are some of the tensions between justice and sustainability and just transition. And I think the last point I want to make is a topic that I'm personally interested in, which is this idea of degrowth. But I'm not getting into that today. And, here, what I just want to note is that when we think about the circular economy, right, it is one way of thinking about our more generalized mainstream economy in terms of our neoliberal economy. It's a capitalistic economy. But when we think about it, as an economy that is seen to be perhaps more inclusive, potentially better for the environment, yes, potentially, it doesn't really question this whole aspect of continuing to grow, right, and expand. So when we go back to that tension of thinking about food waste and locking in food waste to generate a renewable energy, there's still a lot of pressure to grow, right? So if our homes continue to demand are not designed as they should and are not as energy efficient as they can be or should be, if our existing stock can't be retrofitted, and so we continue to need and demand more energy, and as cities expand or are not being thought through carefully, then there's going to be a continued need for more energy, right? If this energy is energy that's coming off of food waste, right, then it's going to demand more food waste, isn't it? Or more biomass or something else to generate that renewable energy. And then this tension is one that I want to kind of bring to light at the very end here, which is this question of the kind of down, to what extent do we can we go on to think about how we grow our economies, right? And how we're putting demand on energy. So the project that we looked at in Germany, I think, is a smart project in that they didn't just put any standard of housing in that development, right? There was a lot of thought to the highest standard of construction efficiency for the build, so that the build itself doesn't draw more energy, right? So it's responsible on both sides, okay? Because it could have just put into practice the engineering side of things in terms of all the piping and all the networks and, and the vacuums and all the rest. But then, how they go about thinking about the way the build has been set out. It could have been, just poor construction, right? So it's still demanding a lot of energy, and then possibly needing to source energy from elsewhere. Now, that brings a real important question, which is that in the case of Germany, we're looking at a new development. But how about applying a model like this one for the Hamburg's water cycle to an existing city where the build is old and not as energy efficient, and retrofitting it would be a massive investment just to get it retrofitted to be ready to take on a model like the one in Hamburg. So there is, for us, when we come back to this whole question about cities and thinking about buildings in cities, is the infrastructure question, right? So we can go on and talk about the engineering, all the different technologies. We can look at innovations in particular buildings like the Gate or in Hamburg and so on, and can talk about innovation. But when we think about the existing cities, and cities where you have communities with poor access to certain resources and so on, intervening in those areas and preparing them for these kinds of adjustments or where we might be looking to re-engineer cities, it's a big challenge. So I think to kind of close, for me, in thinking about the nexus and thinking about cities and places and the spirit of the circular economy, it is really an infrastructure question for me. But I'd be interested in hearing from you what you think. I know that thinking about infrastructure in itself opens up a lot of questions. We're focusing on water, so we can talk about water infrastructure. But once we begin to bring in its nexus with energy and food and so on, we can really begin to create a lot of complexity for ourselves, right? But thinking just solely on water, I think, and thinking about water infrastructure, I think that in itself and how we begin to apply some of these ideas in cities is to an extent really exciting, especially when we look at projects like this one in Hamburg. But in the case of the Gate, I'm not so sure, but I would like to hear from you what you think about a project like the Gate, whether it comes close or is approaching something like the example that we saw in Germany, how they're similar, how they're different, in what way are they interpreting the nexus? Do you think there are nexus projects? And do you have any other examples? If you have any other examples or experiences of other projects elsewhere, I'd be also interested in hearing about those too. Okay, thanks.
Cool, thank you, Richard. This was fascinating, and I liked how you brought examples from Egypt here. And with that, maybe we can open that the discussion for questions. If anybody has any questions or wants to share their thoughts with Richard about the gates or any other project in Egypt, please either raise your hand or just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask the question.
Ahmed.
Yeah, I want to ask about the constriction equity. What does it mean?
Sorry, what does what mean?
Ahmed, can you repeat the question?
Okay, I'm asking about constriction equity. What does it mean?
Constriction equity.
Yeah. So when you're thinking about the, I guess how am I going to put it? So you have, so if you look at a series of these example forms of the tension, so the focus of the diagram is really focusing on the tension between these different notions, right? So you have sustainability and inclusivity. So let's back up a bit. So if we were to be in a discussion around ideas of sustainability, right, we would talk about a lot of different things, right? We might think about it in its most crude sense, thinking about economy, society, environment, and so on. But when we think about sustainability, one of its critiques is that it's very much on the basis of trade-offs, right? So we're trading off the gains in one area like the economy with society or perhaps the environment and so on. So this is oftentimes seen as a kind of a limit of the concept of sustainability. And it also means that we have some clear a sense of what we're wanting to sustain. So depending on who's looking at sustainability, be it say a developer or a planner or an architect and so on, or any one individual with a different set of values, not so much of a professional framing, will have a different take on what's worth sustaining and how and what's viable in terms of what we should be sustaining and so on. And what you then get are these tensions, right? In terms of the sustainability inclusivity tension, it then becomes about, who is being included in this framing of, what is seen or understood to be benefiting or should be benefiting from a drive towards sustainability. And this tension between sustainability and inclusivity also comes in with this idea that you can work towards sustainability, but generate unsustainable outcomes as well. So you can actually reinforce unsustainability. And this is a notion, something that came up some years ago. I think it was 2003 by Julian Ageman in his book called Just Sustainabilities. And he was largely getting at this tension of sustainability and inclusivity, right? The other one is sustainability and recognition. So tensions between sustainability, performance, recognition, diverse value systems. Again, it's very similar to ideas of inclusivity, who's involved in the decision-making process, where voices have been heard, and so on. Here, it's really taken into consideration the different value, the cultural background. There have been and value sets. So there have been some that have, in looking at sustainability, have argued that culture needs to be one of the spheres within this Venn diagram of sustainability. So sustainability and recognition is another tension. Then you have this one here, the last one, which is another kind of tension, and this is a long way of getting long answer to your very short question, which is the sustainability equity tension. So these are tensions, as notes here, tensions between achieving sustainability performance and socially and environmentally just outcomes across space. So this equity bit, I circled this one because it taps back into this idea of transition, right? And a just transition. So as we work toward sustainability, right? It may be one that is, a process that has been inclusive, has involved a lot of stakeholders, so it addresses that first tension. It may be one that appreciates the different value sets in the process, so it addresses the second of the tensions. But the tension here with equity is, what are some of the kind of unintended consequences of driving that particular sustainability outcome. And so this here is very much a focus less on the process and more on the actual outcome. And I think her name was Mahmoud. When she did the study for the circular economy in Egypt, she really raises this particular tension here, the sustainability equity tension, in the context of thinking about the circular economy in Egypt, because she's saying that as we make this socio-technical transition or jump or shift, actually she uses the word shift, not transition, make this shift, we are putting certain people out of work because we're changing technology. So as we shift to new ways of doing things, we also need to train people to be able to work with new technologies and new ways of doing. We need to be sure that they have an understanding of, or a new knowledge or a new understanding of how to do things and so on. So this is where that sustainability equity sort of tension comes up. The efficiency equity is very much about how to ensure that we're thinking about this tension in terms of the resources, right? So thinking about the environmental impact and the limits on resources and so on. So the negative outcomes potentially there, unintended and so on. The constriction economy is again, it's one in the context of what I was saying earlier about the size of the economy, right? And so what are we trying to encourage? Are we still growing the economy while also trying to be more efficient? Because if you're trying to be more sustainable in a way, but you continue to grow unsustainably, it's a zero-sum game. And I think that's essentially what the constriction equity is going on about, right? So we have to think a little about how we currently do things and whether we should be changing our lifestyles, while also thinking about how we find ways to mitigate the sort of negative outcome, the negative effects of the way we do things, namely in this context, the waste product of how we of water, how when we use water and so on, whether we can repurpose it. So I'm not sure which one came first. Was it
Asma
and then Nerman?
Asma first and then Naramin.
Yes. Thank you. And yeah, thank you, Dr. Richard. I would like to ask you about the difference between green economy and circular economy, because I think green economy also focusing on sustainability and resource management. And what is the difference between both green and circular economy? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So my limited knowledge is green economy goes back before circular economy. Green economy was very much tied to a kind of technocentric way of looking at the economy. So how we can begin to green the economy through innovation, technological innovation, and so on. The circular economy is related, but its emphasis there is that the economy is not a linear one. It is trying to loop it back, right? It's trying to close loops and keep the products in constant circulation. So do you remember the definition that we had at the beginning where it's regenerative? The greening of the economy and circular economy is in keeping products moving, right? Through the system, right? So any waste can be repurposed to something else. So we keep those materials in constant circulation.
So you mean that the circular economy is more dynamic than green economy?
Yeah, in that sense, I think I would. Yeah, if you're thinking dynamic in terms of the system's dynamics, yeah. I think the circular economy is a different way of thinking the economy. Then you could say the same for the green. So when I think about the green economy, I think it's yeah, so when I think of the green economy, I think about those aspects of the economy, new technological products, services, software, hardware, you name it, that are feeding into whatever efforts that we are putting in practice to address some sort of environmental challenge, be it climate change or whatnot. So if you are trying to generate more renewable energy through wind power, any of the hardware, any of the technology associated with that would be starting to create new economies around the production of wind turbines, the jobs, the training associated with it, the logistics of delivering these products, assembling them, and so on, right? So it's creating new economies, right? An aspect of the economy. So in that sense, you could say that's a green economy. Politicians will frame that as a kind of working toward a green economy, right? But the circular economy goes a little deeper, probes that a little deeper, right? It's saying, right, okay, there's a part of our economy, let's just put the green aside, part of the economy that is quite wasteful. We waste a lot, right? And we need to address that waste component. That's the bit at the very end. What if we can actually loop that back to the beginning and feed that through the system? That's what the circular economy is saying. So in that sense, the circular economy is a kind of a green economy, because in that reframing of the economy, in terms of thinking about the production cycles, right, and the reuse, right, and thinking about the waste hierarchy and so on, we are creating a different way of thinking of the economy. When we do that, it can also be linked to new technologies and so on. So it has its complementarity to this idea of a green economy, but it goes further, right? It goes deeper, I think. That would be my understanding.
Thank you. Thank you.
Nerami?
Yes, Professor. Sorry for the interruption. I have two questions. The first one, used water which comes from kitchens is considered gray water or black water?
Oh, from water catchments, that would be the rainwater. So in that Hamburg example, they had the three, right? So one was rain, then black, then gray. So that was just capturing the rainwater. So it's not black or gray. It's neither of those. It's rainwater.
Okay, the second question is about your opinion, Professor, about the idea about using gray water and refilling bathroom flush instead of using fresh water as a recycling idea. What's your opinion?
So what's my opinion in terms of reusing water from toilets?
No, using gray water for household cleaning.
No, in refilling bathroom flush.
Yes. Okay, I see what you mean. So in that example, there was talk that some of that once the gray water is collected, that it could be used for irrigation, but they also said that it's very possible to run it back through into the development itself to be used for toilets, for instance. But similar to what Adina said earlier, it's all really down to the design and the engineering. So if they have the toilets fed separately, so that the feed, the supply into the toilets themselves is fed separately from the water supply from the main coming in as fresh, clean water, drinkable water, potable water, then they could do it, right? They could use that gray water, process it, put it out for irrigation. Some of it could come back through into the development and use just for the toilets, and then come back down through the black water. Black water generates the biogas. So it's really about kind of engineering. Now, when you work from a development that is a tabula rasa, you build it up from scratch, it's possible. When we think about re-engineering our cities in this way, it's a massive challenge. Yeah, but when we think about new development, it would be really exciting because, like, for example, in the UK, there is a huge need for housing. So why couldn't, in all the housing that we need, we really start to adopt some of these principles from the ground up? We could, and then gradually, slowly retrofit our old stock. So the answer to your question is yes, it could be. I don't know that they've actually designed that in to that particular model, but I did read that they have that as a consideration, or did have it as a consideration.
That was what exactly I want to listen. Thank you so much. I got it.
You're welcome.
Cool. it looks like we don't have any more questions. So let's thank Richard again. I know it's getting late on your side of the planet. And Richard will send his PowerPoint presentations to me, which I will share. And then I will share, Richard, I'll share the recording for this session with you.
Okay.
So, enjoy the rest of your school. And thank you again for everyone that joined us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adina.
Thank you
Actually,
so much.
this is the last day of the Zoom sessions, and it was
Oh,
a
wow.
great closing.
That's a perfect lecture for closing with
I didn't know I was the last one. So
technology.
I hope I hope that was okay. I hope you all understood it and it was useful. I mean, they're very interesting concepts and they're going to be around for a long time. And so, yeah, it would have been really nice to have a bit more time to learn about the sorts of topics that you're working with, any dissertations. Adina, do you have any sense of
Yes, so
master's students as opposed to PhD students are in the audience today?
Rawan will know, but I will share your contact information with everybody so people can contact you and keep on the discussion as we go in the future. So thank you, Rawan, for inviting us as well, and good luck with your thesis and projects, and hope to see you in some other opportunity, either here or somewhere else. And thanks, Richard, again. Bye.
Very well. It's my pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
Dr. Adina, thank you, Dr. Richard, and thanks for the attendees and participants. I hope you enjoyed the school. The remaining of the time will be working on your projects. Wish you best of luck, inshallah.
Thank you, Rona. Thank you for your efforts.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.